So here are the 6 pillars of the architectural prompt formula. So here, let's just go deeper here. So think of these as a formula as a project brief. If any of these sections are missing to the contractor, which in this case will be the AI, it will start making assumptions, which usually is the wrong ones, right? So the first pillar that we'll have will be the role. So just call it the specialist, right? So this is pretty much assigning a persona. So instead of AI use specific personas to narrow focus, you assign the expertise and the precision to it. You can tell it something like, hey, I want you to be a project manager with 10 years of experience in K-12 buildings, right? So now you're assigning a persona. Now we're going to go to pillar 2. So with pillar 2, you want to assign a task, which is pretty much like the scope of the work. So it pretty much is defining the deliverables, and you just kind of really start giving them the clear task of what to do, whether it's you want to generate a room program, whether you want to create a summary of something, whether you want to create a schedule, whether you want to create a visualization, or whether you want to create a report. That's pretty much just defining the task, right? And the more clear you are, the better. So just think about it as a scope and structure. Then here, where you're going to use it as pillar 3, we're going to go to specifications. So it's pretty much just setting up the tolerances and the details and the constraints of the project here. So the way I like to think about task and specifics is that task, you assign the overall scope of things, but the specific, you assign more the details. You kind of more go into detail of specific things. I'm going to give you an examples. For the task, if you are wanting a summary of the meeting notes, in the specifics, you can tell it like, hey, I need the summary to be divided in bullet points. And I don't want the summary to be more than 2,000 or 3,000 words. And it needs to be in Arial font. So here's where you're giving me more the specifics on the overall scope that you define it in tasks. So that's the way you can think about it here. Major tip I have for you when it comes to that is sometimes emotional prompts will encourage like even a better analysis. So if you tell the LLM that it's very important that this is very critical for the project and that you really value what it's doing, it will actually increase the performance of it, just as a quick tip. Now, number 4 here, and I think this one here is one of the most important ones, is the context. And this one be more like, I don't know, they call it site analysis, but here's more like you provide the background. It's the client, the zoning ordinances, the type of project it is, the time of meeting you have. So here's where you are really providing context to the place, right? Whether it's like you're working in a specific city or a specific county and things like that, then is when you will get into the more understanding really what's in the background. And the thing about context is that the LLM doesn't know what you know as far as a specific site or as far as your experience with specific buildings or experience with specific materials. So here is, if you think like you have a sort of expertise that the LLM does not have, I think sometimes rather than you writing the whole context, you can tell it to ask you questions for the LLM to start generating the context in a better way. So sometimes what I like to do is once I have all these generated, we'll tell it, hey, for me to give you more context on these things, ask me one question at a time to make sure you have anything that you need for you to write the best possible summary or the best possible site due diligence. So the LLM will go ahead and ask you a few questions just to make sure it can actually fulfill as much context as it can to give you the best possible answer. All right, now we're going to go to 5. 5 is very important because it's examples. In 5, think about it as you giving it already examples that you know has been working for you perfectly. So if you've done already in the past of something that you love, whether it's a visualization, whether it's summaries, whether it's a newsletter, whether it's already a code research that you like to do in your company, like for instance, I know that in a company, sometimes we do a few diligence analysis for each specific project. And there are 10 specific items that we collect for these due diligence that are very important because those 10 items connect specifically for us to go and check out the code for us to meet the standards with the city and the county. But there's mainly, I know that you can get like 20 or 30 things, but there's 10 really very important things that it needs to get. So for us to upload an example of how we normally structure our context, I would call it the GOO1, which is pretty much the project information. When I give it that, it will emphasize those 10 items that we collect. and it will make sure like those 10 items are listed in there. So it will look through this whole thing and it will list them like that, right? So think about it as a reference that you're giving it. So not different like if you go to a specific company and you're new in that company, they will give you the standards of how they want things done. And that's pretty much exactly the same thing with pillar 5. And then the last pillar is the notes. And I feel like that's a very important one, specifically for architecture. I want to see those as kind of being the guardrails. And what I really recommend to everybody doing pillar 6 is to always make the LLM list sources of where it's getting that information from, because then that will really minimize hallucinations, and not always just leak sources, but you can emphasize things that are very important to you. Like whether you really want to make sure, like say, like as a reminders, like, hey, make sure you list an example for this, or hey, make sure that you list those 10 items that we really need, right? So here's where you can really give those safety guardrails to the LLM. So those are the 6 pillars that we are pretty much the major ingredients for a very high quality input. And here's a little bit of the things that I was telling you about: reminders, notes, final reminders, formatting instructions, and ask for resources. So that is pretty much a quick overview there.
But first, if you are serious about making your architecture firm grow, or you are an architect willing to learn these systems and apply to your company, I have put together an AI discovery for architects resource that you can access and get familiar with the fundamentals of AI for architecture. So comment presentation below and we will send you the guide to access it on demand. All right, let's jump into the video.
So here are a few golden nuggets when it comes to understanding how to use these ingredients. So we're going to start with principle 1. So it will be to select a role that provides an advantageous role and highlights the skill. Just as we mentioned before, like an example could be you are an expert architect and project manager with over 30 years of experience in K-12 building design. So you're giving it an expertise. Principle 2. When an output requires multiple steps, provide a step-by-step process to the LLM to work through. The more complex the task, the more step-by-step guidance is needed to provide to ensure a high-quality output. So if for whatever reason, you already know like the process that you're making the LLM has 3 or 4 steps to it, make sure you list a step-by-step how the LLM should resolve these problems, right? So I know that in architecture, we like to call this the critical path. So the same is when an LLM, whenever you're giving it instructions, if you know that these instructions require like few steps, make sure you give it the critical path so it doesn't get confused or it just doesn't start collecting all the data at the same time and then it structures in the way that it seems correct for the LLM is maybe not the right way to do it in the process. Now we go with principle 3, which is adding emotional phases encourages more engagement for the LLM in a specific process. Use it in a crucial step or task. So an example here will be the accurate analysis of this site is of extremely importance for the organization, and if we value your careful and in-depth analysis. I know this one here is a little controversial to kind of give it emotional prompts, but the research shows that whenever you do that, it increases the accuracy and the in-depth analysis that it does. So use this carefully and use this just for very crucial specific tasks. Now we're going to go for principle 4, which is adding a few examples improves the output significantly. However, make sure that examples are consistent with each other and keep it between 10 to 20 examples at most. Creating a very detailed prompt, one-shot prompting, as we mentioned before, could be a replacement for not having examples and variables. I know that sometimes because we are doing this for the first times or we are implementing different methods on a company that maybe they don't have already an amazing standards, but they are open for recommendations, then you don't really need to set an example, but just make sure that your prompt, your one-shot prompting is on point, because in that way, you don't really need examples, but most likelihood, you at least get the highest likelihood to get the highest input without having examples. However, if you have examples, make sure they don't contradict each other. I cannot tell you one time where we were talking about to a friend that he couldn't figure out what he was getting. The results specifically was for a prompt in his visualization for ideation. And whenever I went in the hood and I analyzed his knowledge base, I realized that a lot of his examples that he was giving to the LLM were inconsistent. Some of them will have color, some of them will be black and white, some will be photorealistic. So something you want to make sure with LLM when you're giving examples is that they're consistent with what you were asking. So the prompt and the examples are not contradicting each other, because when they contradict, chances are that the LLM is going to give you inconsistent results. So make sure that the prompt and the examples align with each other, and also the examples that you're giving it also align with each other too. I know it seems pretty common sense, but I cannot tell you how many times I've seen this happening. So principle 5, the LLM will add more value to the information listed to the top and at the bottom of the prompt. So use the notes section for reminders or specifics that are crucial for your output. The more specific you are, the better. Avoid any fluff and concise. So this is another thing I like to tell people. Like, normally you want to make sure that the most crucial things you put at the end or at the beginning of the prompt, because those are the ones that are going to read more consistently, and avoid any fluff. Like, I would even go, and if you already have a huge idea in mind and it's like 3 or 4 paragraphs, I will go to an LLM and tell it, hey, can you simplify this and make it more concise so you can really compact it to really what you want to say, and then give it to the LLM. But you just want to make sure you avoid using a lot of fluff, just because the more words it is, the more opportunity there is for the NLM to get confused. Principle 6 will be to use hashtags. Use H1, which it would be single, right? You use that, it will be kind of more like saying like, this is the title, right? And for the main components, right? And then you have the H2 or the H3, which would be the subtitle or the sublabels here for sublabels. And also use bold text for emphasize important words. So if you really want something to be done correctly, you might want to use a bold text in there. Yep. So, and this is an example here. So if you use for the main component, could be examples, will be, as we're saying, like that's one of the main pillars. You can use the hashtag one, the H1. Then for example 2, for example 1, because these are sublabel of examples, it could be 2 hashtags. And because as also example 2, these are sublabel of examples, this could be also 2 hashtags there too. And if you have like an example within the example 2, then that would be 3 hashtags.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so we can send you more notifications. And if you are serious about making your architecture firm grow, or you are an architect willing to learn these systems and apply to your company, I have put together an AI Discovery Guide webinar and a PDF guide that you can access and get familiar with the fundamentals of AI for architecture. So comment presentation below and we will send you the guide to access it on demand. All right. Thank you so much for watching.